Hello, Bill.
Hello, Matt. Welcome back to the DMZ.
Thanks for having me, Bill. I always like it in the DMZ.
It's my DMZ. You're in my house.
It is. Let me ask you, Bill. You can't see me. I'm wearing this sweater, and I feel like looking in my camera here, it makes me sort of look like Count Dracula with a little. It's one of those sweaters that has, I guess, the collar sticking up. So I hope it's not too weird. But it's very warm and very comfy.
It's not a Jimmy Carter cardigan sweater.
Not exactly.
I don't want to give you a bad reputation.
It's like a zipper thing. I mean, it's cardigan-esque, but not specifically a cardigan.
This is more 90s Seattle.
That's my scene, man. The dream of the 90s is alive in the DMZ. You gave me a little shout-out on Twitter yesterday after Harry Reid effectively put the kibosh on the assault weapons ban. I was a little afraid to put that on Reid because he was just seeing the writing on the wall. The votes weren't there. And you brought back up my post from January that Obama doesn't need an assault weapons ban to have a landmark gun control package. I don't think my message was internalized by many because people are still treating it as if it is it's a cave, it's an enormous loss, it weakens the overall bill, and my point always was that it wasn't logical to rank in order of importance assault weapons ban at the top and everything else below because you don't necessarily know that the assault weapons ban is the most powerful and effective tool in the arsenal to combat gun proposal. I'm not making anti-gun regulation arguments, and there's other gun regulation proposals out there that may be similarly effective or more effective. And the goal should be to get as many of those different options in the bill as you can and not get hung up on one or the other. So Reid's not getting hung up on one or the other. I don't think Obama's hung up on one or the other, but I think there's still this kind of bruised feeling that the Democrats are capitulating again. No, Bill, I think they were being smart, and I think you were exactly right. I wrote at the end of the year, December or January, right around there, about how, look, the problem the Democrats have is they have all these Senate races. Red state Democratic senators running for re-election. This would have been a deal breaker. I think Harry Reid said he only had 40 votes for it. This could have been a problem. And frankly, as I noted in something I wrote at the week or at the time, the assault weapons ban really didn't work. Now you could argue that was because they, grandfathered in guns and companies like Glock found ways around it. There were a lot of ways around the law, but it didn't really have an impact. And so to pick that as your hill to die on, metaphorically speaking, politically, for something that probably wouldn't have worked and definitely would have had negative political ramifications for red state Democrat senators, I think that you were exactly right. And I think Harry Reid probably made the smart call. Clearly made the smart call.
Well, it's also as a reminder that when we have these big traumatic events like Newtown with guns, or for example, like the BP spill and the environment, and I'm sure there are parallel examples on the right for certain things. One doesn't come to mind at the ready. There's always this hope that this is going to change the political dynamic, and now is the time to push an idea that wasn't politically possible before. And there certainly are examples in history where that is the case, but it's not always the case. And I think we're seeing that even though this is a very raw and emotional topic for people in certain parts of the country, it's not necessarily true in all parts of the country. And it's the Democrats in those other parts of the country that are having difficulty, changing or shifting their emphasis on the issue. BP spill did not make cap and trade magically possible because people still in oil and coal states had the same views that they had before the spill. And if you are a gun rights person, a mass murder, there were other mass murders before, and your position didn't change from that. I don't want to be overly cynical about it. Doing there is some change. We have seen some people with high NRA marks talking compromise that weren't talking compromise before. I mean, there was something uniquely traumatic about Newtown that did create some shift. It's just not a complete shift that completely upends the chessboard, and that's why you're going to see, a more narrow package than some people had hoped to get. But hopefully what they do get through will be things that are worth trying and may have some impact, and then we can build on that going forward.
And people who, anti-gun activists, obviously, lament the way that politics actually happens, and I'm sure they wish that, the minute after some sort of tragedy that they could have a vote. You won't be surprised, Bill, to learn that I think it's much smarter to make policy from a bit removed, a bit more dispassionate, and that I think this is an example of our system working. I don't know what's going to come out of it, whether or not some sort of background checks will pass or something else. But regardless, I think that this decision should be made based not on a knee-jerk reaction to some horrific event, as tempting as that is, but rather in light of all sorts of facts and sort of weighing all sorts of information, including the Constitution, into it. So.
Well, I think that raises a very interesting question on what is the best way to legislate. I sort of half agree with you. All things being equal, yes, dispassionate legislating, keeping emotion out of it, keeping with hard facts, processing things, having a full debate. Those things are all, I would say, the ideal way to create legislation. However, all those factors are often exploited by forces of inaction to prevent things ever actually getting done. And sometimes you have to ride some emotional wave just to move the ball forward. Even if it's going to be a perfect bill, at least you're doing something that you can test and then learn from and then tweak as you go. So I don't think in a practical sense, neither way is perfect.
Right.
One way you might not act at all. One way you might act imperfectly. I think at the end of the day, you have to have a balance of the two, and depending on the situation. I think with guns, for example, you never get action unless there's some emotional component. Otherwise, the issue just lays dormant.
Well, look, I think both sides.
I don't fault folks who are trying to recognize that in this instance.
No, and you're right. I mean, this is a philosophically neutral move. I mean, if you're trying to get something done, the smart move is to push quick and to try to push it through. And both sides would do it, depending on the issue that they're trying to pass. But having said that, I do think it's good that our system, as a rule, doesn't allow for that.
So it makes it hard. And I mean, this is why, having no filibuster at all probably isn't a good idea, even though it's very frustrating a lot of the time when you want to get something done. And people are still mad at Harry Reid that he didn't do filibuster reform. They didn't do a more significant filibuster reform. But there are lots of examples when, having some break in the process allows for more views, allows for more constructive bipartisanship, allows for a bill to pass that has more buy-in, therefore lasts longer. It doesn't get repealed every time there's a pendulum swing in the electorate. The system is generally created with that. I think it generally works. But, of course, there are examples where it doesn't work, and where people get frustrated and they focus on those instances.
Absolutely. So, Bill, I feel like a lot of my writing and talk lately has been about the state of the conservative movement and all that.
You're coming off a CPAC, where I'm sure there's a lot of discussion about that recently.
CPAC's part of it. I feel like something is afoot, that there are changes in the wind, and maybe it's just me being very finely attuned to nuances, but one does get the sense that change is coming. And we always knew that there had to be some sort of soul searching, but it seems like it's kind of leading, speaking of rapid change versus slow evolutionary change, that it's happening maybe a little quicker than I thought. What's your sense?
Now, what's been the reaction to the right to this this RNC autopsy? I wrote a very glib and mocking post about it. I even acknowledged in the post that there's some serious stuff there to analyze. I just generally chose not to do that because I thought there's a number of moments in the document that just were just too unintentionally hilarious for me to ignore. But there were some actual attempts to break with orthodoxy. There was an acknowledgement that some people do need government. There was an acknowledgement that we should care more about the wages of the middle class than the retired packages of CEOs. There was obviously breaks on basic immigration reform, so we got to be more tolerant towards regarding sexual orientation. We have to have more outreach to minority communities. How is this being taken in the conservative movement broadly? Is there a general acceptance that we do have to change? I mean, there's some good ideas here, or are you getting a lot of pushback?
I think both, Bill. I think it would be a mistake to I mean, it obviously was a big news story, like on Monday, but I mean, honestly, this is sort of like a plank at a convention. Yes, it's interesting to talk about. Yes, I think it's indicative of something, but I think it would be overreading it to say that it's much more than that. I mean, ideas and party positions and philosophy evolves organically, and it's going to have a lot more to do with who the standard bearer is. And as I recently argued, we're not just fighting about the 2016 election. Isn't just going to be about picking a standard bearer. It's going to be about deciding which standard to bear. I mean, there's a huge questions taking place. I think that you can read the tea leaves looking at this RNC autopsy report and see that it's consistent with some other things happening. But Bill, if you told me 5 years ago that we would essentially have a consensus that amongst prominent conservatives that same-sex marriage should be an issue to be decided by the states, and that the immigration, what its detractors call amnesty, would essentially be the de facto position of arguably the two most important conservative politicians in America today, Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, I would have been surprised and how quickly things have changed. The other thing I'm sensing, Bill, which is kind of part and parcel of this, and McKay Coppins has a piece up at BuzzFeed about this. I wrote something at The Week about this. Is one really gets the sense that social issues are being put on the back burner, and that social conservatives are essentially being told you better seen and not heard. You can stay, but your issues are not going to dominate. And that's a huge change. And, of course, it's happening very subtly. No one's loudly proclaiming that we should have a truce on social issues the way Mitch McConnell mistakenly did. Not Mitch McConnell, Indiana Governor, help me out here, Bill. Mitch Daniels.
Bob McDonnell.
Mitch Daniels. Thank you.
Mitch Daniels.
The commenters would have let me know, I'm sure. Mitch Daniels, former governor, declared we should have a truce. It's being framed much differently than that, but it's the same nonetheless, and it's kind of I think it's worth noting.
Well, I feel like this tension between the business conservatives and the social conservatives has been going on for a while. I remember even in the Bush years, there was a sense after a few years that the social conservatives weren't getting their due, that the Bush agenda was all about helping the corporate class, not about helping social conservatives. And then Bush sort of overcompensated with the whole Terry Schiavo ordeal. That was a huge political setback for the right. And so there's always been this kind of a feeling, I think, among sort of the Republican elite that social conservatives were kind of, a bit of an albatross. And now that's sort of coming up, more fervently in this RNC report. But if you have, when I went to CPAC several years ago, as I love to mention, I have such fond memories there, I can't stop talking about it. The mantra always was that we're a three-legged stool. We need all the legs of the stool for the conservative movement to work. We need the fiscal conservatives, the national security conservatives, and the social conservatives. Now, the social conservatives are getting kicked to the curb, and the national security concerns getting kicked to the curb with Republicans allowing the sequester to go through, which hammers the military, with almost everyone in the Republican Party rallying around Rand Paul's anti-drone filibuster, except for McCain and Graham and Kelly Ayotte. What's left? What is the leg that conservatives are going to stand on?
If you consider the fact that they essentially raised taxes as well, that means that they've sort of betrayed all three legs. So I don't want to like overdo this. I mean, it is fair to say that there's soul searching and a reordering, but I mean, Jennifer Rubin at the Washington Post said, I mean, she had a post up which I think rings true, where she said, if somebody runs as the three-legged stool like Romney tried to do, as bridging those three things, they will probably lose. It does seem like that idea. And I mean, look, this is anecdotal. I know there's polling that shows, I'm sure that Republicans around the country have more culturally conservative views, but if you look at the people on Twitter, the conservatives on Twitter with the megaphone making the most noise, it's become a very libertarian movement. The sense is that the sense amongst conservative opinion leaders and those on Twitter would be that if you're against gay marriage, that you're some sort of a bigot, or that you are out of touch. That's a change. That is a change. And if you represent the social conservative movement, ostensibly 1/3 of the conservative coalition, this should be concerning to you. And look, Bill, I think there are two reasons why this has happened. Well, three reasons. Number one, obviously, when you lose elections, you start to do soul searching. But the other two, I think, are the culture changed. I wrote a piece at The Week about how conservatives lost the culture. Politics is downstream from culture. They lost the argument first, and so politics will ultimately follow that. And the other thing, Bill, these social conservative pro-family lobby groups are mostly a joke. When you compare them to, say, like the Club for Growth or other fiscally conservative groups that are much more effective at lobbying members and holding them accountable, the social,
that's a big change from the 90s when the Christian Coalition kind of was the big kid on the block.
Right. If you sell out the fiscal groups by raising taxes or something, they could pour $1 million into your district and beat you in a primary. If you sell out the National Right to Life, they will probably issue a press release. I mean, that's just, and if you support them, they will probably issue an endorsement, not a check, or maybe a small check. And so whether it's an organic change, the culture, or whether it's a DC lobbying change, the social conservatives, I think, are being given short shrift.
Well, and I feel like in the 80s and in the Bush years, I thought that the national security part of this was more of the glue. If you could trust conservatives to not let America get punched in the face. That was sort of the general operating attitude of the American public. So if you disagree with them on social issues, you disagree with them about help for the poor or progressive tax structure or whatnot, you kind of let that go, because the bottom line is you want to be safe. In the 80s, it was the Cold War. In the Bush years, it was 9/11. And now those national security fears are subsiding, and I think that exposes the less popular aspects of the conservative coalition to have to sort of defend themselves on their own, and that's becoming harder to do.
Right, like Frank Mayer, this fusionism idea, which undergirds the three-legged stool. I mean, that, the Reagan coalition was kind of premised on the Soviet Union's existence. And so if you were a national security person, you had obvious reason to work with conservatives to defeat the Soviet Union. That's clear. If you care about national defense, defeating the Soviet Union is obvious. But if you were a social conservative, you had reason to work with the fiscal conservatives and the national security conservatives to stop the godless, atheist Soviets. And if you were a fiscal conservative, a capitalist, you hated communism and that economic system. So there was this glue that held everybody together. There was a coherent reason for everyone to overlook the faults of the others. But, you know, the social conservatives were the last element to join the Reagan coalition to make that successful. And, you know, you're right. I mean, they for a long time they've been arguing, well, what have we gotten out of it? Abortion's still legal, you know. So they were arguing like we get lip service, but we don't actually get legislative change. Well, now they can't even say they're getting lip service. And I think that's the difference. I think that conservatives are rhetorically moving in a more libertarian direction, and not even, you know, giving the social conservatives lip service, because now they're a liability. They prevent you from attracting cosmopolitan moderates and whatever young people, and so I think it's a change. Bill,
Before you get branded a giant sellout here, I mean, I don't put words in your mouth, but you're a social conservative, right? I mean, you're not saying this happily.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a social conservative, and this is a matter of semantics, because a social conservative, I think when you say that, this is sort of like Rand Paul not wanting to use the term pathway to citizenship. When you say that you're a social conservative, people assume, like Jerry Falwell. I would consider myself more a Burkean traditional conservative. And that means that I believe that culture is very important, and that institutions are very important, and that change should be kind of slow and evolutionary, and that we need to always remember that culture and institutions, you know, it's more communitarian. So these are subtle differences, but that's how I would think of myself. Being a
libertarian conservative is not being a libertarian conservative.
I am. Well, there are areas where I'm libertarian too. I mean, it's everybody's so weird and nuanced today. I mean, like I'm basically for decriminalizing marijuana. There are definitely issues where I'm, and I have been for a long time, where I'm more libertarian.
And you're sympathetic with Rand Paul on the drone issue, I know.
Right, where I'm more libertarian. But I'm adamantly pro-life. I'm strongly pro-life. I mean, to me, that is a non-negotiable issue, and the minute that Republicans walk away from that, I think it's very problematic. Now, on the issue of gay marriage, I've been covering it, so I haven't really stated a position. At the very least, I think some sort of civil union should be appropriate. I mean, like the idea that you can't, you know, have a contract with somebody, that you can't designate someone to visit at a hospital or something is obviously absurd. So, you know, but I would also say this. I do think that because that I probably have more of a reverence for the conservative movement than a lot of my peers who write about conservatism. And so, for example, when I've written about, you know, the Go Proud versus CPAC, which is part of this, it's a microcosm of this larger fight. I mean, I think
this is the conservative gay organization that got shut out of CPAC.
Right. And I think that I believe that I've written more down the middle about that, because I understand both. I think I understand both sides of the argument. So, in any event, I would consider myself more of a traditional communitarian conservative than a social conservative. But let's have it out on the comments. What am I? Have at it. No, I do want to bring up. Well, I do want to quickly bring up, because I'll forget this.
Sure.
This new theory that I came up with. You know, during the soul searching, we're looking for a coherent worldview, because obviously conservatism doesn't have one anymore. And here's one idea. I call it up with people. And the up with people coherent worldview says that we love people and that people are good. And if you believe that people are good, this is premised on the very un-Malthusian theory that says that more people equals more ideas. And more ideas. And that's why cities are important. It's where ideas have sex. And people bump into each other. And it's creative. But if you believe the up with people, my up with people theory, then you'll be pro-life because you want more people. You'll be in favor of families because you want families to have more people. You know, the birth dearth, which ruined Western Europe. We need more people. And I think it's also part and parcel of a free market economic philosophy, which says we don't live in a world of limited resources where we're all fighting over the scraps. Like overpopulation is going to be a problem, but rather we can grow the pie. This is all very philosophical, I realize, and we're in the early stages of fleshing out this theory. But if anybody wants to join my Up With People cause, that'll be two of us. So you're welcome.
Well, I mean, I think you're in the pantheon of Bill Clinton's "Put People First" and Howard Dean's people-powered movement. I mean, there's a long, populist history in American politics about trying to say that you're bottom up and not top down, and if you can harness that towards your desired ideological end, you're getting somewhere. So it's not that's not a crazy place to start.
Well, it's a coherent worldview, and it unites. It unites pro-lifers with other sort of pro-family groups and also free marketers. And I think it's also unlike a lot of populist conservatism kind of praises rural areas as being the real America, and I think this has a more urban, cosmopolitan flavor to it, though, as well. So it's an interesting.
That's very William McKinley versus William Bryan, 1896.
Maybe there's a column to be written there. We should co-author something on that.
Republicans used to be the urban party, and the Democrats the agrarian populist. So.
Right. Well, I mean, look. And
I
forgot to mention the other element to this: immigration. This is a pro-immigration philosophy that says more people equals more ideas, and we want more. We are the party of more people, and so this encourages more legal immigration as well.
So this is a big immigration week with you have Rand Paul making his big immigration announcement on Tuesday, where he essentially says he's right pathway to citizenship, though he's not liking that phrase, but it's effectively what he means. And that pretty much, I'm not saying that all conservatives are going to follow Rand Paul wherever he goes, but certainly says even within the most conservative quarters of American politics that there's a split at immigration at least.
Well, it's also interesting,
makes
Bill,
it a lot harder
not to get too in the weeds, but Rand Paul kind of lives at the nexus of what we call the old right paleo-conservative movement, kind of associated with Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul, and the libertarian movement.
Right.
And a lot of times these two factions agree, they align against the neocons. But in this area, this is an interesting move because the old right paleocons tend to be populist, protectionist. They don't like immigration. They want to basically close down the border. I mean, and libertarians, conversely, tend to be open borders, free markets, citizens of the world. They're not nationalist. And so clearly Rand has chosen to be more of a libertarian than a paleo-conservative on this issue, at least.
And you were on the front edge of this in your own writing, are making the conservative case for immigration. You've always argued it not from a crass political standpoint. We got to win the Latino vote, so let's just capitulate here. You've always made a conservative case for that's pro-entrepreneurial.
Probably Up With People philosophy.
That's right.
No, I mean, look, we have to secure the border, but I think we need a lot more immigration, and we should make it easier to immigrate. And I think Rubio's dream is probably a good.
Well, this is my political question to you. I feel like Rand. If I was Rubio, I'd be so pissed off right now. Here I am. I'm Marco Rubio. I was the Tea Party's hero when I took on Charlie Crist. I'm clearly the best choice to modernize the party, to show our diversity, to give it a shot of youth. I've been leading us on immigration. I've been bringing conservatives along to recalibrate our position on this. And here comes Rand Paul just shows up, gives one speech, basically the same position I have, and now he is, the conservative hero, and I've somehow become the establishment toady. But our position's the same. So if I was him, I would be beside myself. I mean, not that everything has to come down to personal ambition, but I think it's got to drive him a little bit nuts that he has somehow lost the Tea Party aura to Rand Paul, and Rand Paul's not even taking different positions than him.
I think we have to disagree on this one. I think if I'm in Rubio's office, we're popping the champagne corks on this one, because this now means that Rubio's position on immigration is mainstream conservative, and that you can't get to the right of him in a primary, or it's harder to, because after all, Rand Paul agrees with him. I think that this was a principled move on Rand Paul's part, because if you're looking at the short-term political move, if you want to run for president, you got to see Marco Rubio as your toughest competitor. And so, if Rand Paul wanted to make a short-term sort of demagogic move, it would have been to go the other direction. He could have run in Iowa as the Rush Limbaugh, Ann Coulter anti-amnesty candidate. And that might have been, as the court representing the old right, that might have been a more, in the short term at least, politically astute move to make for Rand Paul. But I think he instead did the principal thing. And I think, again, Rubio's people shouldn't be in any way, they should be celebrating this, because now Rubio was still the first. This cements his position as being acceptable to conservatives. It makes it much harder for anybody to attack Rubio for being a sellout rhino on this issue. So I think it's a huge victory for Rubio, and they should be ecstatic about it.
Well, I know the last thing Rand Paul wants to be is a demagogue. I know he's a very responsible and forward-thinking politician.
Let me say this too. Let me say this too. For one of the great things about this job, you get to sort of hear what people say about people. And there are people in this business that people hate because they're mean and they're jerks. But Rand Paul has a reputation for being an incredibly nice guy. I just recently heard there was an incident where someone told me that he, in a personal setting, had the opportunity to kind of blow up at something, and instead was incredibly nice and friendly. So it's good to hear. You know who else was that way?
Interesting. When I see Rand Paul, I think unique among sort of presidential mentioned candidates, he comes across as the most arrogant. I mean, he drips with condensation. He's not a happy warrior type. And I think Rubio serves as more in your classic Reaganite mold.
But I think Rand is actually a great guy by all accounts, and I think he's the real deal. He's sincere and he's a good guy. You know who else? One of the nicest people.
But isn't there a crass political part of this? I mean, he's clearly trying to position himself as the candidate of the next generation of the young, and he's got to know that taking the anti-immigrant position is being the candidate of the old. That's not a position that the younger generation is going to want to hear. And I think the drone argument is clearly an attempt to say, and we talked about this last week, that here's an attempt to get the younger folks to break off from the Democrats and embrace this sort of, insurgent, anti-establishment libertarian position. So I'm not totally convinced there's no politics here at all.
Right. Well, it might have been smart long-term politics, and kudos to him, strategically, if that was his move. But the short-term, the move that most bomb thrower, sort of right-wing bomb thrower candidates would have been, okay, if Rubio's for this, we're going to be against it. We're going to call an amnesty, and we're going to call him, So I agree with you. It's possible that it was strategic, but if it was strategic, it was a long-term, kind of, I think, smarter strategy than the knee-jerk typical response.
Fair enough. But as far as my point about Rubio and Paul, I mean, is it inaccurate for me to say that Paul is the conservative hero of the moment and Rubio is being seen more and more as an establishment choice?
I think that's fair. I think that the last 2 or 3 weeks have been amazingly good for Rand Paul. We'll see if he can sustain it. The filibuster was huge. I think both did well at CPAC. But there is something about Rand Paul, we talked about it last week, that if you're a young person, he's kind of revolutionary. Young people tend to be romantic and revolutionary, and they need something to believe in. And there's something about Rand Paul, just like his father, that sort of gives them that, and it's powerful. Obama had it. Republicans often don't have this, but Barack Obama had this, and part of it's as simple as design, the Obama logo, the slogan, hope, change we can believe in, hope and change, that sort of thing. Rand Paul has that, and also the ability to reach out to a more mainstream audience than his father is. He's a formidable politician. But on the issue of immigration, I think Rubio should be very happy that Rand Paul has put his seal of approval on it as an acceptable conservative position, and then they can fight it out over foreign policy, which they disagree on.
Right, and if Paul succeeds in pulling the party to a more Buchananite position, that might make things harder for Rubio. But to circle back to your original point, historically speaking, modern Republican primary history, the establishment pick usually wins. So Rubio's in a better spot.
They usually win, Bill, except for when they don't. And history works until it doesn't. And sometimes parties change. I mean, we've been living in the Reagan era. Not just within the country has been living in the Reagan era, but the Republican Party's been in the Reagan era, and that seems to be ending. It goes back to your point about the three-legged stool. But Bill, parties change. I mean, the Republican Party was obviously once got all the African American votes. That obviously changed, around FDR and the generation that followed. The Republican Party was once more like Rand Paul. It was more of a going back to Senator Taft, and then sort of the paleocons, much more of an isolationist party. Now the neocons took over. I mean, so parties change, and one does get the sense that something is afoot. One does get the sense that the conservative movement is shifting, and I don't know where it's going to go. It feels like it's going in a more libertarian direction right now.
If that is the case, so it would be a interesting test case whether that is a purer message. Doesn't have to worry about three legs of a stool and building this kind of mosaic type of conservative coalition. You just sort of have this one square ideology to rally around. Does that clarify things and make it easier for them to make their case, or does it put them farther away from the center of the country? That, of course, would have to be proven at the polls in 2016.
Now, the conventional wisdom, and what I'm inclined to believe, is that Rand could be very formidable in a primary, but Rubio would be the better general election candidate for obvious reasons.
Just like an establishment person would say.
I'm
sick of your establishment argument shoving these people down my throat.
No, but Bill,
give me the real deal.
No, but I have epistemological modesty, and so I know that I may be wrong. Here's what could happen. I think that's the more likely scenario, that Rubio is the better general election candidate because the world hasn't changed that much, and so he's a better speaker. He's more traditional conservative, Hispanic, all that. But what if Rand Paul were to go up against Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, an old Democrat? And what if Rand Paul built a new coalition that included, young civil libertarians, young progressives, and conservative? I mean, what if we are in the midst of a reordering of the political coalitions, like the way that the FDR and Reagan did? What if Rand Paul, and I don't think this could happen, but what if he were able to cobble together a new coalition with young progressives and civil libertarians? It's not a completely absurd possibility. In a general
No, but there's also the chance that it's 1964 or 1972, where Goldwater or McGovern completely goes into the abyss and shatters their party for several years. When you go with the Rand Paul, you're going for an all or nothing kind of strategy.
Right, because the idea, I mean, conventional wisdom says you could demagogue him for opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and for his father's anti-Semitic newsletters, and you just destroy him with that. It's conventional wisdom, and maybe it's probably true. But what if there's something special about Rand? And what if he can appeal to young people, not just young conservatives? But, I mean, I don't know. It's going to be...
Well, I think, just the same way people on the right looked at Paul Ryan and said, this guy's got a special something. This guy can communicate our principles to blue parts of the country no one else can, and that was all on paper. It actually hadn't been tested.
But Rand Paul and Marco Rubio and all these guys, they're young, they're exciting, they're exceptional, but they're also mainstream conservatives. Rand Paul's something different.
I think they have 3 years to prove it.
Rand Paul's a different
show that they actually have the backing, and it's not just a theoretical case.
Rand Paul would be a different paradigm. I would say the others are very good traditional conservatives. Rand Paul is a different animal, I think.
I totally agree with that. You have to run, don't you?
So my game plan.
Always good to talk
my
to
game
you.
plan is to filibuster, dominate the conversation, and then insist on ending early.
We need filibuster reform on the DMZ.
We should have like Tony Reale from Pardon the Interruption. We need to have like a third person here who moderates and tells us where we got things wrong. Like, it wasn't Mitch McConnell, it was Mitch Daniels. Thank you.
All right, sir. Always good to talk to you.
Good talking to you.
Have a great week.